Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning. Grazie, Professor Breda. I will start now with my presentation, my intervention that I think is good suiting to the intervention of Mr. Bagnaschini, of course, Gianluca, who presented it. The title is The Reuse of Foreign and Domestic Armament and Armor during construction of the Atlantikwall, the so-called Vallo Atlantico, on the mainly Norwegian and French coast. Well, okay. I will start with some general historic instruction to explain maybe the task, the layout, the situation of the so-called large defensive line of Atlantikwall, and also mentioning some constructions, some fortification measures that were made in the last years before outbreak of Second World War in the late 30s to protect German borders. All right. So on this map we can see the situation in Europe around, we can say, 1942. We will not go more in detail for the map, but interesting for us is the western frontier, the situation at the Atlantic border or on the sea. The lines that are marked in these maps are, as mentioned before, the first fortification attempts to secure German borders just before outbreak of Second World War. We have here, it's starting, two small lines called Wetterau-Main-Tauber-Stellung or position, and the so-called Neckar-Enns position. Name given is by small rivers. They're close to these, and so they got the names for that. These were some of the first attempts to secure the western frontier, the borders against France. At that time prohibited in an area of 50 kilometers east of the Rhine, which had to be off army and of course off of any fortification attempts. So these attempts, starting with Neckar-Enns position in 1935 and Wetterau-Main-Tauber position in 1936, respected this free area of 50 kilometers. I have to mention this to be combined with a small, not so famous known fortification line at the Czechoslovakian Bavarian border, which was not so heavily, maybe not so intense, secured like these two lines, but corresponding together against a possible attack from combined French and Czechoslovakian troops. And there's also one unique or small position called Heilsberger Dreieck or Heilsberger Triangolo, mainly like passive fortification, like barrages in that area. It's southwest of Kaliningrad, now Königsberg. So it's around this area. And during construction of these first two lines began also construction so-called Oder-Wartebogen, so a major fortification program to secure the eastern borders, mainly against Poland. Starting also in 1935, and all three programs lasted till 1939. None of them totally completed. Especially Oder-Wartebogen. Situation changed can say, totally. So the large effort was given to the western frontier because of the frightening was, or the threat was more from the western part of Europe, so a possible threat along all border of France. Starting the so-called Westwall, or also said Siegfried Line. Well, these defensive lines were in that way important for also building the Atlantikwall, the so-called later part of the Fortress Europe, as both a lot of designs, so the bunker systems and typologies, especially at the West Wall, were developed and came to use later in the Atlantic Wall. Both the construction, the buildings as themselves, and also what I will mention later more in detail, some can say technical elements, some constructions like armament and the cupolas, the reinforcing parts as well. You can see two small arrows or lines already on this graphic. Of course, we have to mention, especially to compare with the Atlantic Wall, to think about the coastal fortification. There was already earlier than this fortification program on the land frontiers to secure the German coasts, both the high sea island Helgoland, which was de-armed, most of fortification blown up after First World War, and began in late 1920s and early 1930s to reinforce this island. Also to secure Bremerhaven port and these important German ports on the North Sea and some of the islands. And what was already mentioned before, some first attempts or some first fortification along the French coast at the Pas de Calais, just after conquering France and occupying France and of course the Channel Islands, some British territory. Now, marked with this line, the so-called Atlantic Wall in its total, the proposed totally length and strength of this defensive line, but of course, as we know, was more propaganda than in real. Another interesting topic or to mention, to compare with the before Westwall, the quite sure and I think quite clear from nowadays on worth in a mean of propaganda, in a mean of expression or telling, that is something like that. That proved quite for the Westwall, and I think also one of the reasons why they called later in some comparison with the Atlantic Wall. Now I'll take some kind of timeline to go to different parts till we come to what we now know as Atlantic Wall or this definition. Shortly mentioned before, the year for this area important, of course, the year of 1914, that saw the conquering of France, of course Belgium, Netherlands, and of course Norway. And at that time, just in the beginning, already saw some installation of heavy batteries in the Channel area. What is important to say for that, already mentioned before, they had some kind of offensive task, so it was rather offensive strategy at that time in that area. So, as seen here below, the so-called Seelöwe, a possible or planned invasion of Great Britain from that point. So it was important both to secure the coastline against enemy attacks, and rather more important to secure this part of the sea, of the channel, to keep free of enemy or especially naval ships from Great Britain, whatever. And not so important for building the Atlantikwall or fortification, as the English call it, the Blitz. So air raid attacks on Great Britain to bomb them out, or to make it maybe surrender in that way. Both lasting for 1940 till around mid of 1941, and both, as mentioned before, some kind of offensive tasks. So there was no real need to go like passive, to go into a defensive line. But except of these first batteries, and already mentioned in the presentation before, was some kind of passive program, some shelter program that had to secure both the submarines, the U-boats in their bases, of course in the main naval harbors along Atlantic and Channel coast, and some other structures for fast torpedo boat called S-boat bunkers going to be built in Netherlands and in Norway. Now I mentioned Norway. There was a little different situation. We can say right at the beginning, after conquering Norway, as both the coasts had to be secured, and situation was quite another. Of course, it was further apart from Germany, and there was some kind of constant threat by British raids and attacks. Probably, you know, there was some kind of similar situation that Great Britain wanted to occupy or secure Norway by themselves, just coming to some conflict in Narvik harbor during German occupation. So there was much more threat, or how can I say, pressure to secure these borders. Well, another thing is that Norway by itself consisted of quite a lot of coastal fortification, some of them going back to First World War and before, and even reinforced during the years through the war. Well, to go on, the year 1941 brought two general changes. First, the mentioned raids, first starting in Norway, like in March 41, the raid against Lofoten Islands, and first raids or commando actions against French ports. Famous are, for example, Brunewald, to get radar equipment and some technology to understand German technology. Probably the most important fact was the attack of Russia in summer 1941. So the active role went back from the western frontier, from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. So only a few troops had to be left in France, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. So important thing. Altogether, mentioning or leading to a Führer directive, an order to make a large effort of fortification. First directive in that way was in December 1941. with the task to make something like a linear fortification along the 3,800 kilometer coast of Western Europe. Fortification program with no specific designation in what way, in which areas, and so on. So efforts at that time were still focused on Norway, Pas-de-Calais and the British Channel Islands that were occupied. The following year brought several raids. Famous and important are St. Nazaire raid to destroy the Atlantic dock, so important infrastructure for the harbor, and Operation Jubilee, better known as the Dieppe raid, a small harbor, French harbor, which first saw some kind of amphibious action, which was repressed, but feared Germans against further landings or further threatening for the occupied coasts. So first program saw a massive construction program called the Winter Bauprogramm, so winter construction period or program, which consisted now some kind of designated fortified line from from Norway to Spanish coast. And at that time, the designation changed from a new West Wall to first mentioning Hitler saying or calling it Atlantikwall. For short, Operation Husky and Avalanche, so the landings in Sicily and Italy, which brought definite fear against a large invasion, a large landing at the French coast, and leading also to another program, the so-called Schadenbauprogramm, like before the open, I can say here, the mainly open gun position and so-called kettle, which means cylindric position, open gun emplacements, had to be reinforced, covered by casemates, we can say. So now we are already in how it began and what changed during first defending efforts till a definite large building program and the then called Atlantikwall. You can see a well-preserved open gun position in Belgium at the domain Riverside, which is rather good example of open circular position, not very good protected, but with the ability to have 360-degree fire. There are some small chambers for the ammunition, and of course, even at that time, there were small bunkers, shelters for the soldiers, the garrison, and for the ammunition, of course. Mentioning the winter building program, where the main start was given at middle end of 1942 to make a huge defensive line, what we now know as Atlantikwall. As mentioned before, I think also in the presentation before, rather a lot of typologies of bunker types were developed. Some armament, arms and armament were developed, but probably the more important thing from recent fortification system were how the system worked. So it was rather fast to build up the bunkers, as the fortress engineer troops had to decide on which place, which type, like type 141 or 261, something like that. The direction of the arm and the direction of the layout, and after this designation of the parameter, fortress engineer troops were replaced by organization DOT, which were actually the builders of the bunkers, of the structures, and with the marked place and the marked layout, they could start. We can see here some construction works of rather early Atlantikwall program, both to mention at least how many people were working at that time, and some interesting elements as these wooden plates for constructing the reinforced concrete. You can see the reinforcement nets during inside. Just to have an imagination of the Schattenbauprogramm, so the casemate program, maybe we can translate it best with that. Also you can see here the machines for mixing and pouring the concrete for the construction on the left side. And well, I think also rather famous battery at Netherlands coast, Batterie Herrenduin, with also type M272 casemates we have already seen before. Well, I didn't mention there was at the definite program a decision to build up Atlantikwall. With the winter building program, there was set to build up something like 15,000 structures within some 6 or 7 months. Probably theoretical, it would have been possible, but even this construction program that should be a defensive line from Norway to Spain meant some kind of focus, mainly at the body, at the ports like Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Lorient, and these important parts, and some other specific strategic elements. The in between, the so-called open beaches were at the beginning not focused and shouldn't be fortified in a permanent way. So there was a difference between focus with permanent heavy fortification, like this standard unit types also before, and the intervals in between area to be mainly fortified by reinforced field fortification. And there was one of the first major program to reuse. You can see this Bauform, so it's reinforced field fortification, originally designed as emplacement for soldier with machine gun or motor thrower with motors, but could easily or were able to be adopted by light tank cupolas. You can see one of these famous Tobruk bunkers, or officially called, officially designated as Ringstände, which means the ring of the open emplacement, and good suitable or could be adopted. The larger designs like VF 262 to put on top like light or tank turrets, for example like this Skoda type or this Renault FT17, so type 17 turret on top of it. Both giving more protection for the soldiers, also against wind and atmospheric influence, we can say like that, and to get some light protected arms there. Two more pictures, rather a few examples were German type tank cupolas, like this medium tank cupola. I think it's a Mark III tank, and on the right hand side an interesting example, as it is a double recycling. So it's similar like the typology cupolas on a Tobrukstand, but it's original Belgium. So the construction is altogether even recycled as it was reused by Germans. I mentioned before there was, how can we say, some kind of 6-7 years of knowledge of building up fortification lines, these bunker structures with a variety of we can say around 300 or 400 different types. What is rather interesting in German fortification attempts, there are only really few arms, especially guns, that were designated or typical fortress weapons. A change brought the occupation of Czechoslovakia with getting access to the fortification, to the Beneš line, Czechoslovakian fortification system. And this interesting, of course, it was important for them to get how it worked, especially in the mean of the Maginot line, but they could use or reuse and recycle already built-in guns, armored elements like the embrasures, and the already or just in a building state of arms and armament. For the important to get this foreign material may be proved by the many different types of bunkers. They are not all listed. There are some more structures, and of course some reinforced field fortification where they were reused. So I think it's good to see the importance or the worth German engineers saw in these techniques and armament. So on the left, it's also a Skoda type anti-tank gun in its, you can say, original armored plate in the ball mounting. And interesting is also like these two examples, fortification elements from Czechoslovakian fortification with its armed steel reinforced embrasures. Especially interesting that normal designs in German fortification didn't allow in one room or two parallel arms or machine guns in that case. That was some topic on we can say standard unit bunkers, reusing some special or foreign armed material and guns. Now we go back to a bigger scale. And mentioning the large attempt to fortify and arm this huge fortification line with the need of heavy armament, and we can say they had to use what could be found. And therefore I would like to mention 3 examples, in that case only German naval vessels, ships, where they reused their armament. Over time, okay. I'll begin with the only, how can you say, full scale or full aircraft carrier Germany planned. I think laid down was in 1938. Grew nearly till I think around 60%, 65% of completion. Work was stopped in 1941. Opinion changed so often, and works started again in 1942, but definitely was stopped in 1943 with a change in general strategy, like main focus on the submarines, on the U-boat force, on the naval warfare, and a special, again, how can we say, personal disagreement of Hitler himself with the large ships, with the large navy vessels, which forced them to at least to stop building programs, and also some big vessels to get out of list and came out of order. So a rather special or interesting example. Just to continue, it was interesting when the building program for the aircraft carrier Zeppelin or Graf Zeppelin was definitely stopped. It was nearly completed. So I think 90 or 95%. But we can say some kind of good side effect was that nearly all of its armament was already produced, some still in place, like these secondary guns, interesting in casemate carriages on the sides of the hulk, like these 15 centimeter double turrets. So we have a historic picture on the left side showing this casemated double gun in, I'm not very totally exactly for that, I think it's a type R690, a standard unit bunker, and on the top of the right, so the inner structure, really close together guns, and what is interesting, it is also preserved. That's for Oskarborg. It's a small island in the fjord to Oslo. Pre-World War I fortification, even reused for the Atlantikwall and manned during the Second World War. And now a very interesting and worthwhile seeing museum with one of these preserved casemated guns of the aircraft carrier. But the collection as itself is very interesting and shows a good thought of the reused armament and guns in the Atlantikwall. We can see here two German type, like 12.7 naval gun, 15 centimeter single carriage, and two example of Norwegian, also naval guns in small turrets, which Norwegians used for their coastal fortification, and later Germans used. I think I'll say later. Another ship, interesting, it was laid down nearly at the same time, just before outbreak of Second World War. Rather far in completion, but as building the full aircraft carrier Zeppelin, at that time decision was made to make some kind of half or semi aircraft carrier, which Germans wanted to transfer this heavy cruiser with name Seydlitz to transfer in some kind of aircraft carrier. So the superstructure at the back was broken off or partly never built, and they wanted to make a platform for the aeroplanes. what is important for now, so the two rear turrets, so the turrets Caesar and Dora were not built in, already nearly completed, and so they were free for use. Of course, and they came into use in the coastal fortification in that way to reinforce or support the defenses of La Rochelle port in France on the Ile de Ré, formed a battery, the 5th battery of Navy Artillery Department. Just to mention in that example, I think it was on the book you showed before, to see some architectonical elements reused in building these concrete superstructures or concrete bunkers, especially in these special designs for reused naval guns, like here in Batterie Carola in France. So if you compare it with especially heavy cruiser, or even with, well, we can take not perfect example. So the structure itself with some elements is quite similar than naval design and these architectonic elements. Also we can see some cut section, this tower type structure with measuring elements and observation technique installed in several levels, also with a rotating rangefinder on top, which is quite similar than on naval ships of that time. Now we go to maybe some kind of bigger scale. Interesting example, the heavy cruiser, or also designed as a battleship Gneisenau, which had a rather successful, interesting career, was slightly damaged during the Channel Dash in 1942, where some kind of large fleet transferred from Atlantic to North Sea. Gneisenau was a little damaged by a torpedo, came into harbor to repair, was bombed just some weeks later with heavy damages causing by the bombing. So front side of the ship totally burned out, was destroyed, and plans were taken out to rebuild it and to reinforce it. That's why we have we can say, original armament of these triple naval turrets with 28 centimeter guns. We can see here and here the double turrets for 15 centimeter and some single mountings in that area, and 3 double turrets of 38 centimeter that were projected to replace these triple turrets after conversion. As I mentioned before, reconstruction building works and some of the large navy vessels were put out of use, or like these reconstruction works were stopped, and therefore they could bring out the armament and also were reused to arm the Atlantikwall, which in that case, again, rather interesting thing is to bring out turret Bertha, no, it's not true, it's Bruno, Caesar, to form 2 naval batteries in Norway to protect the harbor of Bergen, for example. So this is pictured just after completion, when it was finished in 1943. The third, the rear turret, is still preserved. It was former Batterie Örlandet later reused by Norwegian coastal defense as for Ostrad or Austrad, the former Caesar turret. As I mentioned before, the parts of the ship, especially the foreship, was heavy damaged, partly destroyed. So the turret Anton, the first turret, was not able to be reused as it was burned out. So there, the 3 barrels came to Seezielbatterie Rosenburg, that's at Scheldt River, so at the Netherlands-Belgium border, forming part of the defense district of Vlissingen. And there they came in single mountains, like mentioned before, at Batterie Große Kurfürst, in single turrets on these Navy-type bunker structures. Already secondary artillery, like the 4 turrets for 15-centimeter double guns, came out. 2 turrets came to Batterie Stordal, then replaced to Fanø Island, also Denmark. 2 turrets came there, and the other 2 were thought or should have been brought to the Netherlands, to Batterie Zandijk. Interesting, similar situation, the same turrets, but they came onto a different type of bunker. So this was only one level, M184 design, and this was 2-level bunker. And interesting that even in that case, it was not finished till end of war, but some elements are preserved at the place. And really interesting thing is the project did never finished battery Vogelnest, probably named Tirpitz, so we have only the designation of the name of the village nearby, Oxby. So we do not know exactly what name would have been given to this battery. And there would have come or installed 2 of the double turrets that were projected to build in battleship Gneisenau after conversion, after reconstruction, I can say. Interesting too, I mentioned just for short that these triple turret batteries were finished already around the end of 1943. Batterie Zandijk wasn't really finished, and this heavy battery, it's southwest coast of Denmark, it's not far away from Fanø, even was begun at end of 1944. Of course it was not finished, although nearly all elements of the turrets already were in place. So I didn't mention before, the rather important date of D-Day invasion in June 1944 didn't stop the Atlantikwall program, by far not. For example, proved with this example in December 44, they started work, of course didn't finish, so invasion didn't change or stop the program, although the fortress Europe was broken off even at Atlantikwall. You can see actual situation of one of the 2 Navy type bunkers with a cupola on top. We already saw similar pictures before, just giving an overview of heavy batteries, except of the channel batteries installed at the Atlantikwall. I think it was mentioned before, but of course all these batteries were some kind of reused naval armament, at least some kind of naval elements that were projected or built for later never built battleships. Just to compare or to see other heavy batteries, here we have Pas-de-Calais, which was mentioned before, and here the other, not more than this list before, the place where the heavy naval batteries were installed. So, of course, mostly in combination with the major important ports. For Norway, for the core, for the support lines, for the iron industry, of course, but mainly like the naval bases for submarines and for the S-boats, except of the Skagerrak, so the part between Norway and Denmark, which was more strategic decision to place heavy batteries to block it and to block this sea street. So it's similar like in Pas-de-Calais. I will finish with these two pictures. I think Atlantikwall and these structures are rather famous, wide known, especially these situations, these small or large bunkers drifting into the sea and sinking into the sand and the water. I heard once an engineer said in the, I think in 1990s, these bunkers of B strength, so 2 meters, or A strength 3.5 meters, last for around 500 years. Only most natural threat is to disappear into the sea or in the sand, which was partly during Second World War, but is more in the years after Second World War. The threat is again by man. So quite a lot of bunkers, and even now under destruction, or how can I say, interesting, a really large amount of money is spent to destroy these structures, these bunker elements. I read recently Germany spent till the year 2000 30 million euro destroying or to make these structures disappear. Well, on the other hand, to mention quite a lot of museum. So some museum are starting on these places, especially at Belgium and France coast, and even some of the elements are protected. Some of the places are protected by law till now. We will see how it will go on. Grazie.